Welcome to Classical Etc., a show that dives into the philosophy, culture, and heart of classical education. You're in the studio with Shane Saxon.
On today's episode of Classical Etc., it's the Christmas episode, not the conspiracy episode. And so what we're trying to do today is bring all the warmth, all of the joy, all of the festivity to bear in a conversation about j.r.r. Tolkien, our favorite old fantasy fiction writer.
You qualify it that way.
Yeah, I needed to qualify
old
it.
writer. That's a huge category.
So on today's episode, I've brought in a cast of characters, true characters, who I fictionally refer to as the Goon Squad. And I'm still convincing them this is the best name for this four particular gentlemen. Three, really. I'm not actually a part of the Goon Squad. They are. But I need to introduce them. To my right is Dan Sheffler. Dr. Dan Sheffler is a professor of philosophy at the Memoria College. On my left is Jon Christianson, Latin specialist and Latin instructor for various institutions. And to his left is Mitchell Holley, Greek specialist and principal of the Memoria Press Online Academy. And I actually need Mitch's specialties here because I think that
for
Tolkien,
the first time in your life.
Yeah, this is the first and only time I will ever need your specialties.
Your moment has come.
Yeah, it feels good.
And what I need you to help me with is that I think that j.r.r. Tolkien, when he coined this term, was doing some shenanigans with the Greek language. And so I want to get back to that etymology. Could you explain the etymology of Eucatastrophe and what he's doing with that word a little bit?
Yeah, great question. It's probably best to start with the English word that we all kind of know as catastrophe. Actually has a sort of Greek origin, and it has its origin in two words. One, kata, which is just a preposition, and strepho. Catastrophe would be the word put together. And that's a word that was very common early in Greek, had a long history. Strepho just means to turn, and kata means to like overturn. If you put that together, it's a preposition, right? So if you put kata and strepho together, it means like to overturn. But it also had a particular use in Greek drama, which I'm sure we could talk about in a bit. But just at the very base level, catastrophe means a sort of turning over, a sort of turning about. And then there's a little prefix at the very beginning of the word, epsilon, upsilon, and it means just good or well-pleasing. Another instance where that is used is in the word eulogy, or to eulogize, which would be to say pleasing words, about good words to somebody, right? So an Eucatastrophe would be a sort of good turning about, a good overturning. I think that we can nuance that definition as it's applied to sort of classical drama, but just linguistically, that he's sort of going back to that classical definition, original meaning, and sort of kind of playing with it a bit.
Yeah.
Because we typically think of a catastrophe in English as a sort of calamity, right? Something that's quite bad.
Right. Yeah, I think that's right. So Dan, give us a little bit more of an understanding of the original context that Tolkien used this word in. I know he wrote it in a letter, but then there's this essay on fairy stories.
Right. So this essay actually originated as a lecture that he gave. It's a very long essay. I've read it now a few times. It's one of my favorite little things to return to in thinking about the imagination, thinking about stories, the way that stories work, and especially thinking about fairy stories or stories that involve this sense of wonder, this sense of magic. Tolkien calls it the perilous realm. It's the realm that we go to when we are enchanted, he says. And he throughout this at length with many examples, sorting kind of what counts as a fairy story, what doesn't count as a fairy story, over many pages. He comes to the conclusion that the central feature of a fairy story is this theme of Eucatastrophe. So let me just read this passage from almost the end of the essay, where he says, "At least I would say that tragedy is the true form of drama." So that's in Greek tragedy we have catastrophes, discatastrophes. Where things unravel. You might think of the end of Oedipus, the king, where we've gone on for several acts and things have they're talking and they're talking and they're talking, but then all at once, somewhere fairly close to the end of the action, things start to unravel very fast, and that's the catastrophe. And he thinks that that's the essential element in drama. He calls it its highest function. But the opposite is true of fairy story. Since we do not appear to possess a word that expresses this opposite, I will call it Eucatastrophe. The Eucatastrophic tale is the true form of fairy tale and its highest function. The consolation of fairy stories, the joy of the happy ending, or more correctly, the good catastrophe, the sudden joyous turn. For there is no true end to a fairy tale. This joy, which is one of the things which fairy stories can produce supremely well, is not essentially escapist or fugitive. In its fairy tale or otherworld setting, it is a sudden and miraculous grace. Never to be counted on to recur. It does not deny the existence of discatastrophe, of sorrow and failure. The possibilities of these is necessary to the joy of deliverance. It denies, in the face of much evidence, if you will, universal final defeat, and insofar is evangelium, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. So that's the origin of this term.
Yes. And so in this essay, he connects it to the Christmas story. So we finally come around to this term and why I thought of it when I thought of the Christmas episode. So John, draw that line for us. You've heard this kind of explanation of what Eucatastrophe is and how he coined it in his discussion of fairy story. Why is this term significant for those of us reflecting on the Nativity and the Christmas story?
Sure. Well, the kind of key there as it relates to kind of Christian narrative is that it is a turning to the good, right? It's a good that arises in the midst of something that is not good, right? Which is as true in Tolkien, as I'm sure we'll discuss, as it is in the Nativity narrative, or for that matter, the entire Christian biblical corpus. For example, to begin with, right, we have this fall, we have the fall of man, but it's from the fall of man that proceeds the opportunity of salvation later on, right? And it is from the kind of fallen state of man and the inauspicious circumstances of intertestamental Judea that Jesus arises, right? That Jesus is born. And of course, by the end of the tale, right, when Jesus dies in this seemingly desperate, seemingly hopeless situation, that again, in a single moment of genuine surprise, but also, genuine necessity, Christ comes back. So it's baked into the very kind of Christian idea about the good, or the idea about sort of how the good is accomplished for man, that sudden goods arise out of seemingly desperate and seemingly normalized desperate circumstances. That is the natural state for man to have no hope.
Yeah.
But that there is a unique and kind of distinct hope that one can point to certain occasions as arising.
Yeah. And I think to untangle that even a little bit further, we have to figure out how to differentiate Deus Ex Machina, that literary device where the hand of God reaches in and saves the story inexplicably, and this idea of Eucatastrophe. Dan, do you think that you could maybe throw some attempts at differentiating those two ideas? And I think that plays into why Eucatastrophe is specifically Christian.
Right. Yeah. So for those not familiar with the Deus Ex Machina concept, it was frequent in Greek dramas for the tragedy to reach such a point of tension that there's really no way for the protagonist to escape the trap that's closing on them. And so they would actually have some kind of machine, some kind of crane mechanism or something that would swing onto the stage an actor portraying one of the gods, and the god would swoop in at the last moment, typically in the very last scene, and rescue the heroes. I think of an easy example would be Iphigenia at Aulis, the play of Euripides, where they're fleeing captivity there, and Athena swoops in. I'm sorry, it's Iphigenia at Taurus is this one where Athena swoops in right at the end. The king, the Taurian king, is on the trail of Orestes and Iphigenia, and the goddess swoops in. And some people, not myself, but some people feel that a Deus Ex Machina element in a story is almost cheating. That the author has worked themselves into a fix, and you have this situation that really can't be resolved in any kind of organic way, a way that's organic to the plot, organic to the characters or the world that they're in. And so they have to introduce this thing from outside that's completely artificial, and just to, wrap it all up. And there's some people, again, not myself, feel that there's something deeply unsatisfying in a Deus Ex Machina ending to a story, because it's discontinuous with the character development that we've seen so far. And you resolve the tension, you end the story, but not in a way that really brings a resolution to you as the reader or the audience of the drama.
Yeah, and so how would you differentiate that from Eucatastrophe?
Well, yes. So I think just reverse everything that I just said as the criticisms for the Deus Ex Machina. Now, one of the reasons I kept saying not me is because I do think that in the context of Greek tragedy, the Deus Ex Machina device is an expected literary device, and once you accustom yourself to that as the progression of the literature, it doesn't feel as unsatisfying. Okay, but I do think there's something different with Tolkien's notion of Eucatastrophe, where you can kind of see that this sudden turn that turns towards hope or delivers from danger or from certain doom was meant all along, that the story was building towards that. In the next paragraph after what I read, he said, even modern fairy stories can produce this effect sometimes. It is not an easy thing to do. It depends on the whole story, which is the setting of the turn, and yet it reflects a glory backwards. So this notion that the glory of the Eucatastrophe at the end has to be organically implied and reflects its glory back over the whole tale. And you, from the perspective of the end, you can kind of look backwards and say, aha, it was intended all along. I'm reminded of the O Felix Culpa in the liturgy, that even from the very fall of Adam, there's a looking forward to the resurrection of Christ.
Yeah, I think another way to state kind of the difference would be using an illustration could be Lord of the Rings itself. Mm-hmm. So Eucatastrophe is Frodo giving into the inevitable pull of the ring, and he puts it on right when you think he's going to throw it in Mount Doom. He says he's not going to, because he wants to keep the ring for himself. But because of a prior act of kindness, Gollum, grabs the ring and then he falls in. So that catastrophe is the inevitable drive of the story, but it's a sudden turn that's for the good. Whereas the eagle showing up outside of the mountain moments later, that's more on the Deus Ex Machina level, where it's not necessarily the inevitable drive of the story. Those are two ways you could kind of illustrate the difference literarily.
If I could qualify kind of the role of the outsider divine coming in and affecting all of this, both in terms of Tolkien and in terms of Greek tragedy, I think we can make that distinction a little clearer. So in Tolkien, for example, outside of Lord of the Rings, you have the Silmarillion, which everyone thinks that they should read and never actually reads. I don't remember how far I actually got in, but I know I read the first part. And in the first part,
I've read it multiple times. I think it's very good.
well,
I agree.
in the first part, during the creation of the world, right, Tolkien's world here, the world is sung into existence, right? And it's clear that it's basically sung through these kind of agents, these angelic figures created by the Tolkien facsimile of God, right? And one of them, Melkor, is singing a disharmony, right? Is intentionally trying to sing a melody that does not work in the midst of this harmony. And yet, Tolkien describes as Melkor is doing so, that no matter what false note he tries to sing, that Ilúvatar, right, God, Ea, basically just reflects or responds with his own song or his own melody that brings that in, right? So no matter how much evil this kind of evil source, this kind of Satan analog tries to insert into the world and successfully inserts into the world, he can only do so with the kind of omniscient, omnipotent power responding with a melody that ends up turning that disharmony into a new harmony, right? And so again, this kind of evil substratum in the creation of the universe ends up being accounted for by creation, right? Yeah. And that, I think, in its own way, is symbolic of Eucatastrophe at its core. That essentially what is by all appearances evil, and what is kind of by intention evil, can be accounted for through the right confluence of events. So, for example, you were mentioning Iphigenia in Aulis, another Euripides play, which really shows the opposite of this, is what's it called? Orestes, yeah. For those of you who have read the Oresteia by Aeschylus, the more popular, the more vanilla version of the Orestes story, read the Orestes. It's a huge diversion and a surprising diversion where you don't have this kind of eucatastrophic situation where the House of Atreus and the curse of the House of Atreus leads to Orestes being in this horrible position where he's killed his father and must be avenged. But then because of his situation is able to make his way back through Athena's help, again, through divine help, to a natural conclusion with the trial in Athens. The Euripidean version of the story, simply put, involves him not receiving divine help, him being pushed to such a desperate edge where he takes Helen and Menelaus' daughter captive and is going to throw her off a building. And then suddenly the god shows up and says, wait, hold on, stop, right? It's a true intrusion in that point. So we have the same story, one of which is eucatastrophic, right? One which has the involvement of the gods working cleverly and kind of properly shepherding all the aspects of the story in such a way that all of these negative, all of these sinful, or all of these bad situations all end up with this surprising and yet joyful conclusion. Then you have the Euripidean version where it's not eucatastrophic at all. It's merely catastrophic. Mm-hmm. And then there's this accidental fix on the part of this Deus Ex Machina approach.
Right. So Mitch, I want to bring you in because coming back to the Christian story, Tolkien mentions specifically incarnation and the resurrection as eucatastrophic. And now that we kind of have this broader understanding of that term, how are specifically the incarnation and resurrection eucatastrophic? And as Tolkien said in that, an evangelium, good news for human beings.
Right. I think that's the biggest connection here, that he's connecting this turn in the story, that this pleasing turn in the story with a sort of, in the Latin, evangelium, right? Or which is actually a Greek word, the evangelion, right?
The Greeks always had it first.
The Greeks always had it first. The euangelion, the good news, the gospel, right? So there's
that you root.
And there's which again goes back to the importance of knowing Greek, for one. Number two, it's a reminder that this whole turn serves a pleasing and good end. The best example of this must be the story in Genesis, right? Where right after the fall, you have what theologians and philosophers call the proto-evangelium, the first mention of the gospel in Genesis 1:28 or 3:18. Is it 3:18 or is it 128? I can't remember. Go look them both
Genesis.
up. It's in Genesis. I believe it's in Genesis 3:18, not 128. That's the creation mandate. But in Genesis 3:18, you have this first mention of when God is meting out the curses that are a result of the fall. He mentions that the way that the story is going to be unraveled, it's going to be brought to a sort of a Eucatastrophe, is when the seed of the woman crushes the head of the serpent. And so right there, right after the story completely unravels, where God creates a perfect man, they live in perfect unity with God, they have a perfect communion with him, and then they mess all that up. Instead of relying on God and trusting his wisdom to define what was right and good, they decided to define what was true and good based upon their own reason. They didn't place any sort of faith or trust in God. They tried to define what was good and wrong themselves. And so then they eat the fruit, and then they blame each other. Then things start to deteriorate, and they have to leave, right? But right there, as the story is unraveling, there's this first mention of the pleasing result that will come as a result of all this fall. And this goes back to the Easter liturgy, the Felix Culpa, because what did St. Ambrose said? Oh joy! No, maybe this is Augustine. I can't remember. Something about. Perhaps you remember the quote better than I do, but oh pleasing fault that would bring such a redeemer. Right? Is the full quote there? And what that is referring to is the connection between the first mention of the gospel in Genesis and the eventual return of that in the Gospels, where Jesus is the inevitable result of this fall that happened thousands of years earlier, right? So, and if you think about that as a narrative, from a narrative that started in Genesis and then concludes with Revelation, the thing that is that moment of Eucatastrophe, that turning the world upside down, is when God enters into the story. And maybe that's a good way to distinguish between Ex Machina and forgive me for not knowing Latin. I knew the better one. Maybe that's the moment where Ex Machina, God out of the machine, meets sort of the Eucatastrophe, because if the God out of the machine is sort of the divine hand working explicitly to sort of like save the situation, Eucatastrophe is maybe the same pleasing result, but something that bubbles up from within the story. And in the incarnation, we see both of those things happening, right? We see God interjecting himself into the story, but also this was the plan for the story all along. The plan for the story all along was that the Messiah would come, that all that was broken and shattered would be made right. And this has particular, I think maybe is most acute in sort of our anthropology, right? If the main problem with the fall was that man relied upon their own wisdom to define what was right and good, we needed a perfect man to come and live and show us what it would be like to rely upon God or himself, in this case, since he's divine, not trying to commit a heresy here, to define what is true and good and beautiful and right and wrong, right? And so then, and therefore inviting us to do the same, right? So that Eucharistic moment is a sort of invitation then for us to both recognize the benefit of that, but also see the entire story as a Eucatastrophe, the entire story of human history. And I think I don't know if it's in this essay, but he invites us to see, Tolkien does say specifically elsewhere, that he sees that point, all of human history, the Eucatastrophe is the incarnation.
Yeah, that's right. And looking at that story, you see mankind's condition over and over again illustrated as corrupt. And when God becomes man, you're like, oh no, now he's one of us. This is bad, but that it ends up being the turn that leads to salvation.
And you can see there that it's not this artificial break with everything that had come before, as though God had worked himself into a corner and just, as the writer of this plot, he's like, oh, I don't know what to do with my main characters. They've got
swing into Jesus.
Okay, well, I guess we're just gonna
throwing someone off the roof at this point.
Yeah, exactly. It's altogether different from that, and you see that because it's right there in the beginning of Genesis, that this is where we're heading all along. Now, if you were someone in the Old Testament, you might not have fully understood that this is where we're heading all along. And in some way, you have to have that light and that glory that shines its light backwards over the story from the end all the way back to the beginning. You have to. There's a lot of stories where I have to read it a second time,
right?
Because you get to the ending and suddenly the ending changes everything, and you have to go back and you have to read all those scenes a second time, and they have a completely new meaning.
I see
the
dead
Old
people.
Testament is this one's a little different.
Sure. I see resurrected people.
Yeah. But we can see that it's not an artificial thing. It's organic.
To the
and
story.
where we were heading
Yeah.
from the beginning. Yeah.
Right.
And it can still be organic with the interaction of God as part of that system, of course. Like Boethius in Consolation of Philosophy deals with this when he's kind of working through the question of free will. How is free will possible in a world of cause and effect, right? And he describes a happy turning, a happy chance. He describes a man who is plowing a field. And if I recall correctly, as he's plowing the field, he comes upon a stash of gold, right? And how we would describe this as, again, a happy chance because him plowing the field didn't cause the gold to be there, right? And yet, is it really random? Did the gold just arise out of nowhere? No, Boethius makes the case that probably person A dug the gold down there and buried it, and then person B just happened to be plowing in that field, and two completely innocuous events that were not good in and of themselves happened to interact in a way that was beneficial, right? So the interaction of God and man can be person A and B, right? We can be doing our own thing. God can be doing his own thing. And it's the interaction of those things that mundane, well, not that you'd call anything God does as mundane, but seemingly mundane, ordinary, there we go, can come together in a organic and confluential good.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So far our conversation has been going from this term Eucatastrophe towards the Nativity, using that term to help us to understand the Christmas story. But in the essay, it seems like Tolkien does it the opposite move as well. That the truth of the Christmas story helps us to read other stories differently and better. So Dan, how does this help us to see value in fairy stories, fictional stories, and what Tolkien would call the truth of them?
Right. Yeah. So he makes the point that there is a kind of literature out there that is escapist, where we're trying to get away from reality. And he says the most powerful one is death, that we have potentially a problem with death. We're afraid of death. And so we like to read tales in which a mortal somehow finds immortality and escapes from that situation, right? And he says, okay, that's maybe fine. That's a literary thing that we do, but that's not the heart of these fairy stories, because in fact, it's supposed to be the other way around. That what we find in the perilous realm, this other world that is somehow outside of our ordinary daily world, it's somehow magical, it's somehow not constrained by the limitations of physics and these kinds of things. What we find there is, in fact, truth. We find there reality, because if they're crafted well, they are taking the truth of this world and presenting it to us more clearly than we can see it in this world. I'm reminded of a passage in Plotinus where he's reflecting on statues of the gods. And there's a passage in Plato where Socrates thinks that art is always an imitation of an imitation, because the realities that we experience here are imitations of the divine realm, and an artist is simply painting a copy of what's already a copy. Okay, but Plotinus suggests that in fact the artist, in creating a statue, say of Zeus, is not looking at some dude who happens to look like Zeus. He in fact is turning his mind to something transcendent and divine and creating that in stone. And in fact, that work of art that he makes in stone might be a clearer reflection of that Zeus masculinity, whatever that represents, okay, than any particular dude on the street.
Sure.
Okay. And so I think that is the function here of fairy stories, that and of Eucatastrophe in literature generally, is that the true thing is the incarnation and Christ's death and resurrection. And these stories are successful insofar as they see that deep structure in the reality of things and then reflect that back to us in a clearer way than we could perhaps perceive in our quotidian real world.
Yeah.
If I have a corollary, a Tolkien corollary to that, I do think it's interesting how Plato's presentation of the role of art, the role of narrative, is distinctly negative, right? Again, imitation of an imitation. Right?
Well, we might want to fight about that.
Sure, yeah. Okay.
I would like that.
Whereas Plotinus is more positive, that basically having this constructed thing basically trends upward as opposed to trends downward. You're inviting a little bit of the divine or the understanding thereof by crafting it in narrative, in art, in craft. Tolkien takes the latter stance. I don't remember where it was, but Tolkien, I believe in his letters, talked about basically mythopoeia, the creation of narrative, as sort of a sub-creation, right? That I am basically being not literally a god, but being a lesser version of God in a way by participating in his chief operation, that being creation, right? Now, mine is nothing like his, right? But neither by quantity or quality. But it's, in a way, almost a form of worship of God to participate in his primary operation. I use the example of when my 2-year-old son tries drawing something or writing something, right? Obviously, it's not as good as what I can do, I assume. But, there's something wholesome about it. There's something good about, one's, this is going to sound vain, creation, participating in your operations, and very likely our participation in God's operations.
Yeah.
And going back to what you were saying, Dan, those stories that are most effective, that are most sort of transformative, are stories that are sort of participating in that sort of in echoes of the Evangelium, right? Of this Eucatastrophic moment.
Mm-hmm.
And so we could probably just go on for days talking about how we can sort of analyze beautiful pieces of literature and pick little echoes of these turns that can happen in the context of the full narrative, but also in the smaller narratives that you might see, in a particular story. A great example would be like Brothers Karamazov at the end of Brothers K, where you have the main character who has a Russian name, and so I dare not attempt it at this point, who is sort of presiding over this. Well, and I'm going to give away the ending, but
spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert.
You can't talk about Eucatastrophes without spoilers. They're all at the end of the story.
Yeah.
That's a great point. And actually, the ending of Brothers K is quite confusing, and most people don't really like it because it doesn't feel very cathartic, right? It doesn't feel like it's actually an ending. But viewed from this perspective, there's actually a lot of value that this ending has, because you have the main character presiding over the sort of funeral, a dirge of a child, of an innocent child, and he brings to mind his friends he brings to their mind the life that this child lived, and said as a sort of call to action. So if we would but remember the life that this person lived, his death will have infinite amount of meaning in our own lives when we try to live the way that he lived. And so this thing where we rejected him while he was on earth because he was unpopular, but now that he's dead, he will live on in our minds in a more acute way. And he, as a result, will change the way we live. So you can already hear the sort of Christian echoing, this sort of eucatastrophic moment where this innocent has died, which is the main question of Brothers K, right? If an innocent dies, would you allow that to happen so that the world would be changed? That's the moral question of Brothers K. And then that ultimately happens. And then the answer is yes, that was a beautiful exchange, sort of, because it'll forever now change the way that we lived. Whereas before, if he had lived, then none of the characters in the story would have changed. They would have just kept rejecting the little boy. And
yeah. And let me be the one to offer an example that's not Russian literature or a reference from Plotinus. And that is, there's a great little book by j.r.r. named Echoes of Eden, where he goes through different literary selections that are echoing the Evangelium, the promise, the Eucatastrophe. And one of them is Harry Potter, Book 7. When Harry goes to face Voldemort one-on-one and he dies. And it could be a tragedy right there. But he happens to be one of the Horcruxes, spoiler alert, and so he lives. And it's the end of evil. It's just a recent example of this same, it isn't arbitrarily inserted. It's where the whole story had been going for thousands and thousands of pages for 10 years. But it's a sudden turn that it goes toward good. And I think all great stories achieve some kind of resonance with Eucatastrophe.
I mean, even the simplest stories like Winnie the Pooh, right? And in Winnie the Pooh, one of my favorite Winnie the Poo stories.
You're going to have to pull this together for us.
Yeah. No, that's why I'm here, John. To pull this whole podcast together.
Okay.
That was an overplay. But Winnie the Pooh, it's Winnie the Pooh has several short stories about Winnie the Pooh, right? And in one particular short story, Piglet and Pooh find a set of tracks. And they're fearful that these tracks are actually a woozle, which is who knows what that is? No one knows. But it's a scary animal. And so but yet they're like kind of tracing the tracks. Little did they know they're actually walking in circles because they're following actually Pooh's tracks. They were not a woozle's tracks. And so the tracks get more and more because they're going in circles. And so they see more and more tracks. And then they begin to get really scared, like they're being chased by this woozle. Come to find out the sort of turning of the moment right when Piglet runs away and Pooh is about ready to sort of succumb to the woozle. He finds some other character comes in and says, you're actually just following your own footprints, the thing that scared you the most. So right at this moment, there's a sudden turn where we realize that the pain all along was actually just you follow your own footsteps, right?
That brings up something that I wanted to link in here, which is that the moment of Eucatastrophe is often accompanied by a moment of recognition. Okay, an onymenesis. This where some character is unmasked or the protagonist comes to some realization that what they thought was true is not actually true. So, of course, the archetype of this is Christ, that we have this mystery of who the Messiah would be and what character the Messiah would come. And finally, in the end, we have this unmasking of the mystery, unveiling, and we have a moment of recognition. But you can think of lots of examples of this in literature. In the Odyssey, where things seem like they're kind of falling apart at the home of Odysseus, and it's all up for Penelope. She's going to have to marry one of these suitors. How is he ever going to figure this out? But the real identity of Odysseus is lifted, and he comes back home. He returns and puts everything to right. Or for Tolkien, we can think of Aragorn and his unmasking of that he really is the king, and he's not just some ranger from the north.
Yeah, I love that example in the Odyssey because you have that really weird scene where the suitors have that strange like paranormal vision before Odysseus is, and it's the recognition is starting to happen before they even know who Odysseus is. It's a great point.
Yeah,
there's a sort of reflection that a reflection that happens after the fact that helps you see everything that occurred up to that point, and from a completely different light. And not all great stories can picture that well, right? Because it's almost like you're telling, as the author, you're telling the story two ways, but the reader doesn't find out that there's two stories going on until the very end, right? And so it's a true gift of the artist. Only the greatest artists can sort of bring this to fruition in a compelling way. I'm sure a lot of people have tried it in a non-compelling way, but it just is a reminder that that the greatest stories are usually told by the greatest artists.
Yeah, and which I think, to kind of cap it off the conversation, the Odyssey is an interesting example because it's written presumably 1,000 years before Christ, and yet it echoes something that's going to happen in the future. And so there's a greater artist over it all who's baked these deeper truths into the realities of our universe. Guys, this conversation has brought me so much joy, and this has been a real gift for me this Christmas season. So I appreciate you being here for it.
I'm happy to be present. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Classical Etc. If you'd like to show your support for the show, then you can leave a like below. If you'd like to add your voice to the conversation, then you can comment. And if you want to follow along with us on this journey, then please subscribe. Thanks, and I'll see you later.